Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. If you listened to our Take 5 yesterday, you may have remembered that I was talking about two very different ways that Christians look at salvation and the decision that is made in order for us to be believers. That one group concentrate very much on God's decision to choose us before we were even born. And the fact that when we are saved, once saved, always saved. The other group of Christians would concentrate much more on the human part of that decision, that we make a decision to follow Christ, and therefore those Christians would be much more likely to believe that you can actually backslide and you lose your salvation if you fail to keep walking in faith in Jesus Christ, and if you become apostate and turn away from him. Now, over the years, these two groups of Christians became known as Calvinists and Arminians. The Calvinists, because their system of theology was devised by the 16th century French theologian John Calvin. Arminians, sometimes you hear people calling them Armenians. That's not correct. Armenians are people who are ethnically from the nation of Armenia in Eastern Europe, like the Kardashians. So it's Arminians, named after Jacobus Arminius, a Dutch theologian who lived in the late 16th, early 17th century. Now, Calvin and Arminius never met and never debated together. We can be sure of that because Jacob Arminius was only 3 years old when John Calvin died. But in another sense, they have been arguing for 500 years, because 400 to 500 years, because their followers have sometimes really gone for it, hammer and tongs, and insulted each other, called each other as heretics, denied each other the right to be called true Christians. And generally, the followers of John Calvin, who believe once saved, always saved, will be found, for example, in Presbyterian churches and most Baptist churches. Whereas the Arminians, because one of the great Arminians was John Wesley, would be found in the Methodist church and the churches that came from that and sprang out of the Methodist revival. There were two men who were basically the champions of each viewpoint. One of them was called George Whitefield, great evangelist, a wonderful evangelist, and the other was John Wesley. Whitefield was the champion of the Calvinists. Wesley was the champion of the Arminians. And they would have these debates with each other, and they would tear each other's views apart and everything else. But the story goes that one day, George Whitefield was speaking in a meeting, and one of his followers put his hand up and said, "Mr. Whitefield, do you believe that you will see John Wesley in heaven?" And people were, this is going to be good. What's he going to say about his great rival that he disagrees with? And Whitefield thought for a moment, and he said, "No, I don't think I will see John Wesley in heaven." Oh, and his followers rubbed their hands. Oh, wait till the Methodists hear this. They'll be so insulted. And then George Whitefield went on to say this. He said, "I don't believe I will see him in heaven, because John Wesley is a man of such holiness and such faith that he's going to be right up at the front of the crowd gathered around the throne of Jesus Christ. And as for me," he said, "you know what? I'm nowhere near him in faith and holiness. I'm going to be much, much further back. So I probably won't see him in heaven because there's going to be so many people in between us as we stand before the throne of Christ." I love that. I love the fact that this man of God, who also had an immense intellect and was prepared to stand up for his beliefs and state them in no uncertain terms, was still prepared to show the utmost respect and grace towards a man who was sometimes his theological opponent. And you know, we live in a time whenever we have people now bashing each other because they believe differently about so many different things to do with Christian doctrine, even because they believe differently about an election that's taking place on the other side of the Atlantic. They start throwing insults at each other. And that's not the way Jesus wants us to be. We need to take an example from George Whitefield. And whether you belong to his theological camp or whether you belong to Wesley's theological camp or whatever you believe about these things, let's concentrate on the things that unite us as Christians rather than the things that divide us. By all means, be ready to stand up for what you believe and to state your case and to state it well and to point out the weaknesses in what you see in somebody else's position. But let's do it in love and charity and with respect. Because if we do that, no matter whether you are right or wrong theologically on every detail, you will still be used by God to manifest his grace and his love. May God help us this day to do that with one another in Jesus' name. And join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.